Good morning. We're here at 4Ace Cycle in beautiful Pacoima, California, to do a 4-speed big twin transmission article. Basically what we're going to do is take this transmission out, disassemble it, show you what to look for, and then show you how to reassemble it. Some of the procedures we're going to do are going to have to be done outside this building, mainly because it takes a special hone for certain aspects, which we'll show and point out to you as we go along. This is a 1965 panhead that belongs to our friend Al Keaton, who just got it. The thing had been sitting outside for like 20 years, open to the elements. It's nasty, dirty, and he disassembled part of it so we could make easy access to the transmission. Follow along. It's nothing hard, nothing you can't do at the house as far as taking it apart and put it back together. Just got to pay attention to the details, and you'll be fine. And it'll be leak-free. That's the main thing that people complain about, is being leak-free. We're going to get started now. Okay, the first thing you gotta do is get this transmission out. You'll notice that the inner primary is already on there, but Al had taken it loose for us, so we're just going to pop it off by hand. There's 4 nuts and bolts that hold the transmission to the inner primary, and there's 3 bolts that hold the inner primary to the engine. Once they're removed, you can just pull this, of course, it comes off. You notice how nice and clean it is after sitting outside for 20 years. We're going to buff this up, clean all the gasket surfaces before we put it back. The transmission is actually held in place to a plate. The plate bolts to the frame. We're going to take out 4 bolts to hold the plate to the frame, and then there's a 5th mount right underneath the kicker cover. So when you would kick the motorcycle over, it would not put any strain on transmission, the main shaft. So there's all the bolts are 9/16 hex head. Okay, we're going to take the transmission out here. There's 4 bolts that hold it in, like we said. There's 2 in the front. The bolts come in from the bottom and thread into the plate. They're 3/8 fine thread. And they're kind of nasty because it's been sitting for so long. But the parts cleaner take care of that easy. My associate, Mr. White, has already loosened and removed the other side bolts. And the reason we're taking a plate with the transmission is because on the bottom of the transmission, as you'll see, there's 4 studs that index it to the plate. There's not enough room here where the top clears the frame for the studs to clear the plate. So it's always easier to take the plate with it and then take the plate off once the transmission is free of the frame. All right, that one's ready to go. Now back here, underneath the support, you'll see a big bunch of grunge. There's an actual bolt head underneath that. We're going to scrape away some of the grunge so we can get the socket or the wrench on. You can see this stuff just coming off. It's always nice if you've got to run a motorcycle to clean it real well before you attempt this. But as you can see, this thing hasn't run for a number of years. Okay, we should be able to get in there now. Oh, I don't think that thing's ever been out since it was new. This one, this back left one, is a little bit tougher because you can't get a socket right on it because of these reinforcing ribs that index the primary cover. That's out. Take the speedometer drive cable out of the engine. Okay, we got all 5 bolts out that hold the transmission in the frame. We're going to slide it out this side as a unit. Hold on. What the hell is that thing? That's like that. Get that down. Okay, now we're going to transfer this to the bench. Okay, we got transmission out. Now I can show you the front mount for the plate. Now this is a through hole for a 3/8 bolt, 3/8 fine thread that threads into the transmission mounting plate. The rear mounts are welded to the frame and they're drilled 3/8 fine thread and welded right to the frame. So that locates the transmission mounting plate. Over here is a 5th mount. You'll notice that it has a groove in there, and that's also a 3/8 bolt that goes up into the transmission. It's slotted like this so you can get some adjustment of the transmission on the plate back and forth till your primary cover fits on just the way it should. Or if you're running a belt drive, you can just put the belt drive on and adjust the transmission back to get the proper belt tension for your application. You can notice it's nice and grungy, that we'll have this all cleaned up before we put it back in. It's perfect time to clean it now when you can get to it. All right, let's move on to the transmission in the vise on the bench. All right, we have the 4-speed up here on the bench. It's going to be a lot easier to get apart. First thing we want to do is take off the speedometer drive cable here that screws onto the drive. And of course, this is just as gummy as everything else. And you'll notice it's got a little square drive in the end of the cable. The other end routes its way up to the dashboard and drives the speedometer. We'll set that aside for Wes to clean. The next thing we'll do is take off the clutch arm. Just undo the washer and nut. And it's got a square drive in here, so this arm should just, oh, this is good. You notice the shaft comes with it. That's not good. The shaft has another square drive down here that has the actuating arm that pushes on the throwout bearing. We'll show you when we get the side cover off. We'll have to fix that. Next thing to do is get the plate off the bottom of the transmission. Boy, that looks good too. And there's 4 3/8 nuts and washers that hold this plate on. You'll notice over here is the 5th mount, right here. See, the studs locate the transmission to the plate, and this will allow this to slide back and forth on the frame to get your adjustment. It's been that way since '36. But this 65 has the ears to mount the inner primary cover. 36 to 63, I believe, or 64, they didn't have the inner primary cover that was solid, that mounted the transmission solidly to the engine. You can see that hasn't been off there for a while. Just full of junk. That's got to be a good 1/4 inch of solid mung. Another job for Wes. Okay, to make it easier for us to disassemble it, we're going to take the transmission and put it on this plate. Now I better show that plate first. This is a replica of a transmission mounting plate. It's made by Jim's Machine up in Camarillo, California. It comes with this little piece of angle iron on it that would clamp it in the vise. I put this piece of metal I've had for years on it so I could grip it differently in the vise. I could grip it like this, I could turn it this way, any which way I wanted, to make it easier on me. A plate like this can be made out of 1/4-inch flat plate. Just take your transmission mounting plate, lay it on top, trace it, drill some holes, and you're good. The transmission goes on like that. And we'll take a couple of nuts and just put them back on so it'll locate it and keep it from falling over. All right, since we got the transmission mounted in the plate on the bench, so it's pretty solid, you can move it around. We're going to take the top off. The top's held on by 10 countersunk flathead Allen bolts, of which accumulate dirt and grease. Sometimes it'll keep your Allen wrench from seating all the way in the socket. So I like to go through and clean them with a pointed tip to get any kind of dirt out of it, like that. You'll notice this one screw here is a little bit taller and it's got a straight slot screwdriver slot in it. That is the breather bolt. There's a hole that comes up through the bottom, which we'll show you, and that's how the transmission breathes. Because as the transmission gears spin in the oil, it'll create a little bit of froth. And during the winter time, when it's cold, it'll condensate will accumulate in the transmission. But as you ride it down the freeway at 60 miles an hour, that condensation will actually turn to steam and leave the transmission via that vent hole. Okay, I'm going to protect the cameras here. I just take a little bit of brake clean with a straw and go in These are two of the worst ones. Every one of these screws is the same length except for these. These are longer because it has to go down through this part of the ratchet top. Okay? Damn. May have to resort to the other one. I don't think this thing's ever been apart, to be truthful. These are 1/4 24 threads. Okay, while we were away for that commercial break, I went through and loosened all the bolts so it would make it a little bit easier and we don't have to take forever to take them out. In fact, I go. One of the things when we get around to inspecting this, we're going to look for stripped thread holes. And since these are 1/4 24, it would require a different set of helicoils. But this being what it is, I don't think it's ever been apart. I don't think there is going to be any stripped bolt threads, but we'll find out. Okay, we've removed all the screws except for these two on the top. But here's that vent screw I wanted to show you. You can see the air would escape up through here and then through this little side port here. That always goes closest to this dowel pin. There's two dowel pins that locate the top to the case. It always goes to the closest one on the kicker side. Okay, now so I already loosened these long screws up. And you can see how they're different. And you can see how the dirt and stuff just attacks them. And actually, if you don't scrape it out, you can strip the Allens off before you can get a good bite on them. Okay, that's all 10 screws. Now we want to take the top off. We're going to have to use a persuader. The persuader would be used over here. I'm going to need a piece of wood. Well, I got a brass drift here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll swing it around. What I'm doing is I'm putting a brass drift here and right here on these shoulders to tap it loose. You can see we've already broken loose a little bit there. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to pry on this top. Maybe not. Right at this dowel pin here. Okay. That's what it looks like inside, only messy. What I like to do is it's in neutral. This is your neutral indicator, not indicator. This is the detent that allows the drum to index in each gear, and this is your neutral indicator light. But when the shifter forks are between gears, you know it's neutral. So what I'll do is I'll put this back on just lightly. And what that does, it'll position the shifter forks where it should be with the top in neutral. Then you take this and kind of roll it off. Nice and easy. And that'll let you know what it looks like inside. And I can see here, with the help of my flashlight, this is your 3/4 shifter fork. Third gear here, fourth gear here. This shifter fork should be centered between the two gears. And the shifter fork looks perfect here. This is your second shifter fork. That's your first gear, this is your second gear. And you look down here and there's a dog that'll engage it. Since we rolled that transmission top off, it gives you the position of the shifter clutch between first and second. It should be centered. If we look down in here, it's really close to first gear. See how it just moves back and forth? But it was almost touching first gear. So when we reassemble, we're going to move this shifter fork over to the second gear side, maybe 10, 15 thousandths to make sure it's centered. Another thing we got to pay attention to is the countershaft cluster back and forth. Can you hear that noise? What we're going to do, that's dictated, that end play, by a thrust washer that's on the end of the countershaft cluster between first gear and the case. I always like to measure that before I take anything apart to see what kind of play came with it. Even though there's oil in there, and you always set your end plays up dry, that end play should be between 7 and 12 thousandths. So I'll take a 12 thousandths feeler gauge, and it goes right in. So we'll have to adjust that. Not much, just a few thousandths. Let's go back to 7. Like that. And that goes in nice. Okay. Then we're ready to take the rest of the shifter forks come out next, and then we'll take the side cover off. To take the shifter forks out, we have to take the sprocket off because the shifter fork shaft comes out to the left side of the transmission, and the sprocket is usually in the way. To take the shifter shaft out, there's a little set screw that we have to uncover right there. Okay, while we were away, we had to give it a little heat around this set screw to get it loose without messing everything up. And we almost set ourselves on fire. You missed that part. Try not to do that. Set screw comes out. You can see that it has a little dowel on it, and I'll show you where that fits in the shifter fork. Okay. Now, like I said, we only put this on before by hand to show you. There's a hole in this side of the case that you would take a probe and push the shifter fork shaft out the side. It's been in there enough that I don't think it wants to move readily. Okay, like I said before, we're going to have to remove the transmission sprocket so the shifter fork shaft will come out the left side of the case. What I have here is a sprocket shaft socket. This one was made by Jim's machine, Camarillo. It's the correct size for your lock nut, and it's left-hand thread, so you would turn it clockwise to remove it. One of the features of this socket is it has a 1/2-inch drive, so you can use an impact gun if you have to, but just a regular ratchet would do fine. And to make it easier, you would lock, since both your shifter forks move back and forth, you could lock it in 2 gears. So here it's in neutral, and you put it first and fourth, and all of a sudden it locks up. That would give you the tension you need to remove it with a ratchet. So we're going to take the sprocket off of the 4th gear and set that aside. And there's a lot of grease and stuff over here where your shifter fork shaft would be coming out. Since the shifter fork shaft is so tough to get out in this configuration because of all the grease and stuff, we're going to take the kicker cover off, and there's a little hole in the case that we can put a dowel pin in and push the shifter fork shaft out the side. So now we're going to turn our attention to the kicker cover. Okay, we got most of the hardware removed to take the kicker cover off. You notice that Al, the owner, already removed the kicker spring. It's usually a good idea to disengage the kicker spring before you take the cover off because it's spring loaded. And as you pull it off, it'll rotate around, probably catch you on the hand and make it hurt, which we don't like. And like I said, you'll notice this one, the stud came out with it. When we go back to put it back together, we'll put green Loctite on the stud and put it in before we put the kicker cover on. Okay, one more. Okay. One of the problems you usually run into on a kicker cover, if it's hard to get off, is if the bike ever went down at any time in the past, it may have bent one of these studs. And that way you just have to kind of walk yourself around without damaging the gasket surface, which we'll address anyhow. And then the kicker cover should pull right off like this. And here's your throw-out bearing. See, it has a notch. The notch is actuated by this little arm. This is what the shaft of the clutch arm came out of. It would come down in, fit in that square, and as you work the clutch back and forth, it would press on the throw-out bearing to disengage or engage the clutch. That looks good, except it's got a little bit of rust on it. This is your kicker gear. As the Kickstarter pedal is depressed, it would turn around like this, and you can see that the teeth and these teeth would mesh and allow this to come out and turn the main shaft, turning the clutch, turning the primary, starting the engine. When you release the kicker pedal and it comes back around to this stop, that stops in here, there's a plate back here. That plate will push in your floating ratchet gear. Stick my fingers in here. pressing it back like that so it doesn't engage the main shaft. When the pedal comes around and that plate disappears, the ratchet gear comes out, engages the main shaft, and as the pedal swings down, it'll turn the transmission main shaft, turning the primary and starting it. And this looks good. It's some kind of dowel pin that I don't know where it came from. We'll have to investigate that. It was laying right here in the trough. When I get to this point, I always like to take my finger, drag it through here, and see if it's got any kind of metal debris. And this has got a little. A little silver is not bad. If you cut your finger on a flake, a metal flake, then you have a problem. And this isn't bad at all. It's pretty normal for, what, 25 years of wear. You can see, if you get in close, how that silver color is there. At least it's not milky like a milkshake. If that was the case, you would have water in here, which would break down the oil and start to rust the hell out of everything. Okay, now, here's that hole I was talking about previously that goes right across to the shifter fork shaft. We're going to take a little push pin, put it in there, and we can tap the shifter fork shaft out. And see. We'll take one of my little Allen drivers. Somebody's going to have a fit about that. But you can see the shifter fork shaft coming out. A little more persuading with a swinging press. Okay. Shifter fork shaft is out. Well, we'll be a second. Pull that out. You can see that the shifter fork's dropped down. This is your 1-2 shifter fork. Look at this. It will be where it moves the dog back and forth. That's an engagement area, which is in damn good condition. It's got a little bit of wear here, but not bad. But you notice how this one looks. It's got like a shoulder that comes back here. It's different from this one. You'll be able to see the difference. All right, we set that down and pull this one. And usually what you have to do to get this one out, because the speedometer drive gear is right across from where the shifter fork lives, usually got to engage the shifter fork clutch into a gear to pull this straight out. You'll notice that this one has the same wear patterns, which is in good condition, but you notice the shifter fork is not as thick up here. Let me get the other one. You can see the difference. You also see the difference here. The 1-2 has got a bigger shift area on the clutch, the shifter clutch, than the 3-4 one. Okay, got them there. Take that the rest of the way out, look at it. Checking for shafts, I take my fingernail and just drag it along. And if it catches on anything, you may be able to emery paper it out, or you may have to replace it. You can also see here this little notch. That notch is indexed into this hole where the set screw is, and that little dowel pin on the set screw will go fit into that notch to keep the shifter fork shaft from walking itself out. Later models used like an E-ring here, but basically the transmission is the same throughout its life until they went to a different top, which was only for a few years. Okay? Okay, well, we got all the covers off. Now it's time to take the gears out. First thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the countershaft gear cluster. That's held in place by a lock nut, or a nut and a locking plate on the left side, or the right side under the kicker cover. It has a little tab you bend over once you get it torqued to spec. So just take a little chisel, bend the locking tab up out of the way, and check to see if the locking tab has 3 little tabs, so you can always get a flat to lock it in. Sometimes people like to bend up more than one flat when it's not necessary. The nut is a 7/8, of which we have a socket right here. I think these only things go to like 30 or 40 foot-pounds. And of course I'm wrong. I need a little bit longer. There we go. Okay. There's our nut. And here's a little locking plate here, which we'll just there we go. There we go. Now you notice the locking plate has a flat. That flat index is on the countershaft. It also has a flat on this locking plate here. See how it's flat and it rubs against the main bearing plate. That keeps that from turning, so you don't have to worry about your shaft turning inside the case. Now, just give it a little love tap. Okay. Here's that plate I was talking about. It's got the same type of flat in there. Now, the countershaft itself and the gear cluster ride on needle bearings. There's a set of needle bearings, roller bearings, in each end of the countershaft. When I take them apart, and they come apart, I like to keep each set of bearings on the respective end. Another thing people are going to give me hell about. Why is this thing so tough? Okay, after using the wrong tools to push the countershaft out, we got it. You'll probably be able to see here where it rusted inside the countershaft cluster. But where the bearings ride on this end here and this end here looks pretty good. We'll know better once we put a 3M pad on it and clean it up. But now we can pull the countershaft cluster out. Usually it comes straight out like that. You'll see here are the needle bearings that support the first gear end. Here's also needle bearings that support the other end, the speedometer drive end. And you can see there's a little bit of rust on this washer that captures so the needle bearings won't come out past the case. So what we'll do is we're going to carefully set this over here, because I like to keep the bearings on their respective ends until I get a chance to inspect them. All right, the countershaft's out. Look inside here, see if there's anything strange floating around. There's nothing. So now we're going to take the main shaft out. To do that first, we're going to remove the 4 screws that hold the main shaft ball bearing in place. And since we went away, we saw that one of the screws has been mashed over and kind of slightly bent, and that's where that dowel pin came from. Or actually, that's what did the damage, was the dowel pin. The dowel pin came out of the backside of the Kickstarter gear that fits into the cover. This is an oil slinger, and this is held onto the plate with one of the screws. Oil, as it spins, would hit this little trough and feed down on top of your throwout bearing to keep the throwout bearing lubricated. Okay, going for that fourth screw that was damaged by the dowel pin coming out of the back of the Kickstarter gear. Let me get this thing out of here and you'll be able to see mo better. That's good English. We actually had to take a chisel and open up the screwdriver slot. But if you look at it this way, you can see how it's bent over, and it was actually mashed a couple times by that dowel pin coming out. We'll replace that. All right, theoretically now, this is all loose. We can move the main shaft cluster over so we can get to the third gear snap ring, which is located inside here. So what we're going to do is we're going to tap this. Here we go. You can see how the plates moved out. All right, inside here, let me turn this around real quick for you guys to see better. Okay, we turned the transmission case around, moved the main shaft out. Now we're going to take this third gear snap ring off to allow us to remove the main shaft and third gear and the shifter clutch. The third gear is held on by a snap ring that fits in a groove on the main shaft, which you pry out with screwdrivers as best you can. We got ours started. As you can see here, I'm moving it with the screwdriver blade, and you want to rotate it. Make sure it's completely out of the groove. Slide it all the way as far as you can towards fourth gear. Then you can pull the main shaft out. Finish taking the snap ring off. As you can see, then third gear slides over and off the main shaft. Now if you can see down inside, here's that casting I was talking about earlier. If this was a 3-speed in reverse, the reverse gear would go in here. But that cast piece prevents us from taking the main shaft with third gear out of it completely. But we can now pull and put this down. Sometimes this countershaft gets a little stuck. I mean, the cluster gear. Okay, what was holding this up was the first gear thrust washer had fallen down inside the little trough where the drain bolt is. So we take that out. Now this thing's going to come right out like it was made to. You're going to leave, of course, like it was made to. Got to get third gear off. Here we are. Like that. And the main shaft will come out as a unit and look like that. This is where your third gear rides. Then there's a washer, and here's a groove for the snap ring that holds third gear on the main shaft. This is your cluster gear, first, second, your main shaft ball bearing, your support plate, floating kicker gear, and this is your fixed kicker gear that actually will engage when the main shaft turns. This surface here, from here to here, goes through fourth gear. There's a bushing inside that, and you only want like 1.5 clearance there. And you look for any kind of ridges, drag your fingernail across it, and check it. But we'll go farther once we get everything cleaned up. So you can take this, set it aside, and we pull out third gear. Third gear washer that indexes on the main shaft. And here's the snap ring. We're going to throw the snap ring away. You always replace the snap ring. There's no reason to take a chance on a $1 part. All right, now we're looking inside. There's nothing left except for fourth gear right here. That simply slides in and out of the race. Now this is it has 44 roller bearings, needle bearings, that roll around on this. And you want to make sure you get every one of them out. And we're going to take this and set it aside and keep those bearings separate from the countershaft bearings. What makes this easy, you can actually see, I don't know if you can get in there and see the roller bearings that are still on the inside the race there. And we'll just take them out. And put them over here. Now the rest fell down inside here. So we'll just take a little magnetic screwdriver, or we take this magnet that Wes has thoughtfully provided for us, and just drag it around inside here. Okay, we're going to remove the main seal that seals fourth gear to the case. This seal is the greatest source of leakage on a big twin 4-speed transmission. You can see here how the metal is shiny at the bottom where oil's been coming out and just taking the grease off or keeping the grease away. This is your seal race, this piece of metal here. And there's a notch in that race that a little L key would index this race to fourth gear, so the race would turn inside the seal. A lot of people don't pay attention to that L key, and this one was missing. So what happens is fourth gear will spin inside the race and just not seal anything. The seal lip is on the inside, so this would turn with the fourth gear and contain the oil into the box. So let's pop that seal out. By just pushing on this. You see the seal starting to pull out or push out. There it comes. Right. Here you can see the inner seal race. You see these lines, that's where your roller bearings contain inside the race itself here. There's a little piece of cork gasket that helps seal the oil coming out so it won't go around the outside of the seal itself. Now we want to wipe, we'll give it for a closer inspection. But the one thing you want to look for is any kind of pitting on your race where the bearings ride. You also notice on fourth gear, the bearings ride here. A lot of times this will pit, and you want to make sure there's no pitting or scarring or, like I said, anything you can feel with your fingernail is bad. This looks like in great condition. And once we get this all cleaned up, we'll fit fourth gear on the main shaft and feel what the bushing's like. The last thing we got to get off the case, or two things, I'm sorry, is a speedometer drive, which is held on by one screw. And mucho dirt. Wow. Okay, I'm going to take this. This drives off the speedometer drive gear on the countershaft cluster. All right, so that's about it, except for we're going to turn it over and take the drain bolt out of the little trough down there. And what we need is our little drain pan. I'm going to step out here for a second. Here's your drain bolt, hidden behind. There we go. What you want to inspect is this boss here to make sure it was nice and flat and no ridges or, well, that's just dried dirt. The bolt itself, or drain bolt, has a little shoulder on it, which will show better when we go to put it in, but it would have a little copper washer with a shoulder that indexes in it, and the shoulder would seal against the bolt surface and this drain surface. And it's easier to show once we get everything cleaned up. So now let's do the parts cleaner. We'll clean everything up, then we'll inspect everything, look at the bearing surfaces, look at fits and all that stuff, and get our gaskets and new seals ready to go, put it back together. Easy. Okay, we had our wash boy wash all the mung off our case, and now we're going to prep it to make sure that it doesn't leak when we put it back together. The first thing I like to do is I like to take a stone like this, put a little 3-in-1 oil on it, and rub it along the gasket surface. This will remove any burrs that will hold the gasket off the gasket surface and allow it to leak. After that, I take a handheld drill with a little countersink and just chamfer the top of the bolt holes so there's no little risers holding the gasket surface up. Just like that. I also go inside here where the plate, bearing plate's held in, and do the same thing. Okay. Get that far, then I take the stone again and start working on the side cover gasket surface. And all I'm doing is just rubbing it lightly, keeping in contact with both sides of the gasket surface so there's no burrs. Turn the case over. Look at all the mounting studs, and these are interference fit stud to keep the oil on the inside. And when I mean interference fit, they drill and tap the case 3/8 16. The studs have a 3/8/16 thread on it, but it's a little bit off, so as you screw the stud in, it actually seals itself into the case. They make studs in different sizes, 7/16 if you have to drill one out, or 1/2 inch. Another thing to look at is your 5th bolt boss. A lot of times if a transmission was loose in the frame, the vibration would cause this to have a little raised edge. You would take the stone and just rub that until you get a nice finish across here. Same thing with your oil drain bolt. Now here's where we have a problem. Part of the problem getting the oil drain bolt out was the threads are stripped. And it's got a little bit of material knocked out, so you'll never get a good seal, you never get the bolt tight. We're going to have to helicool that, which we'll do at home and bring it back tomorrow. That's a 1/2 13 thread. And then we go here and look at the studs. This mounts the inner primary, and this boss here fits inside, so it locates everything nice and tight. Well, there's always burrs here. We took a little flat file, took all the burrs off, made sure everything's nice. And you look up here, you can see a ridge, or a groove actually, that was ground into the case. That is from the rear drive chain. As it got loose, the chain would flop up and down and come down and rub the top of the case. Also, when we put the primary cover on, inner primary cover, I'll show you the bottom where that thing flopped around right in here. This is not bad. I wouldn't even bother welding that up unless you're building a show bike. You come over here, take the stone, and rub your surface right there for your speedometer drive. Again, while you're in the bottom, you would look for any kind of burrs along here, because this is where the transmission plate sits. Okay. We also inspect every single hole to make sure it's got threads. If not, you have to helicool it. This one's great. There's not a missed thread in there. And you also want to look inside at our countershaft bushings. The countershaft comes through here and indexes off this side. You look, see if these are scarred or worn down excessively. You look at your main case race. You look for pitting or scoring or anything like this. This is in great condition. As far as I'm concerned, another cleaning and fixing that drain bolt hole, and we're ready to go. After this is cleaned, we'll show you tomorrow, or show you after we put the helicool in, what it looks like. The drain bolt itself is in good shape. It was missing a little washer that we have in our kit, and while we're at it, we might as well show the kit we have. We got it from Jim's Machine up in Camarillo, California, and it's a really deluxe kit. It comes in a box with damn near every kind of lock, tab, bushing, seal that you need to rebuild your transmission, all the way up to like an 84, I think. It has bushings, 1st gear, 3rd gear, kickstarter gear, 4th gear, all the little lock rings and stuff that we'll use as we go along. Complete set of gaskets and seals for both the kickstarter gear, the top gear, the top cover, the ratchet top, the main seal, the seals for a clutch hub nut, and it even includes a new countershaft. So we're good to go. We already cleaned, or actually Washboy did, our countershaft cluster. We inspected the inner race of this and it's fine, nice and clean, no pits or anything else. Everything looks good. This is well within tolerance, so that's ready to go back in. Next thing we gotta do is take apart the cluster gear on the main shaft, because we're going to replace the ball bearing that rides inside the case. To do that, we clamped it in a vise and we have to pull the ratchet gear off. That takes a special puller that I have a Harley-Davidson puller for years, but you can use a snap-on bearing separator puller to do the same job. You don't have to run out and get the factory tool. We'll show you that in a second. Okay, we got the main shaft clamped in a set of aluminum vise jaws to prevent it from being marred. And what we're going to do is take off the main shaft nut that has like a little locking tab. What you do is you put it on, then you fold the tab up to hold the nut in place. A little chisel action. like that. A 7/8 socket. Nut comes off. Little locking tab comes off. Now the fixed ratchet gear is keyed to the main shaft. Usually you got to have a special puller to do that, of which I have. But you can get away with using a bearing separator, like a snap-on or something, where you would press this down, put the bearing separator in here like a clamshell, pull it up together and off. The Harley part comes with this little center that fits here in your main shaft, so you don't mess up your main shaft when you use the puller. The puller looks like this. It has two sides, one with a little flat groove and the other with these two little pins together like that. The flat groove is for pulling off the ratchet gear. The pins are for pulling off, believe it or not, generator drive gears. So what you do is you get them together like this. You take the sleeve, tap the sleeve down past your groove here. Take the T-handle, slip it inside so it engages the grooves, and make sure it centers on your main shaft. Like that. Of course, I just missed it. That means it's loose. Take your ratchet gear is inside here. And what we'll do is just tap this like that. Take the sleeve off. Two keyways, two keys. You notice this has a little ball bearing in the circumference. That's where your throw-up bearing will index on that and lock in so it spins the same as the main shaft. Okay, to get the keys out, you just pry them out like that. And they're square keys, not Woodruff. Then your floating ratchet gear comes right off. What we're going to do is wipe the oil out of here. Take your tension spring off. Wipe this down. Put this back on and feel it. See how much it wobbles. If it wobbles excessively, you can replace the bushing in here. This thing is in great shape. Your bearing retainer plate comes off, and here's your ball bearing. And actually make a little bit of noise. So I always like to replace these. It's cheap. They're only like 20 bucks for that bearing. So to get that off, we have to undo this nut to undo the lock tab. This is a 1 3/8 deep socket that fits well over the main shaft. Actually, 1 3/8 is the same as top fork tube nuts, but we won't delve into that. It's on there nice and tight. That's like 40 foot-pounds. So what we're going to do is get another bite. No problem. Nut comes off. Locking tab comes off, and the locking tab's got 3 little pieces of bent steel that actually index into the splines of the main shaft. And when you get it on there, then where the flat of the nut lines up, you just bend it up. Now to get the bearing off and a cluster gear, okay, the bearing comes off. You reuse the housing but not the bearing. The cluster gear will come off here like that. Now you can inspect the main shaft for any kind of wear, and since we have 4th gear out and 4th gear bushing, it would slide on here like that, and you would take it and see how much it wiggles. This one's got maybe a couple thousandths. We have to look at the bug. I think spec is 1,500. We can always push a new one in, we get it. But this one looks very nice. There's no grooves, no scarring, no rust. And here where 3rd gear rides, there's no galling or pitting of any kind. Same way here with where the floating Kickstarter gear goes. So it looks good. The only thing else I'd like to do with this is I like to put it in a lathe between centers and spin it to make sure it's not bent at all. But looking at the condition of the bike, I don't think so. I don't think it's been down, but what we'll do is we'll probably put it in a drill motor before we put it back together and just spin it slow and look at it. Any kind of bent action will show up very quickly. And that's it. We got everything apart. The bearing comes out of this. And since we're not using it, we can beat right on it. Just like that. We'll reuse this. This goes away. You can hear how dry it is in there, which means it'll probably last a while longer, but while you got it apart, never hurts to put one in. That bearing doesn't come in your rebuild kit. You would have to go take it to a bearing shop and have it just cross-reference. I just bought a new one for this job, and it was, I think, $16 for that bearing at a bearing place. Okay. With the main shaft done, we're going to move on to the top and take that apart and clean it, inspect it, and look at it. Okay, we got the top. I like to do this in a vise with the safety jaws, just because it's easy, and when you start trying to break hardware loose, it's nice and stable. First thing is take the cover off. Boy, these are tight. And the shift arm. Shift arm's got the 3 screws and 2 dowel pins that locate it. The cover is the same way. Inside here is an aluminum housing that actually houses the ratchet mechanism. with 6 screws. 5 of the screws thread right into the top itself. This 6th screw has a nut on the end to hold it tight. You'll notice that that 6th screw is a little shorter because it doesn't thread into the case. It just goes past the plate and the nut retains it. All right, the aluminum housing should pop right off with a little persuasion. Like that. And it has a gasket. Set that aside. And here's your ratchet mechanism. In here's 2 springs. In here's your paws that actually catch the shaft to turn your drum. And see how it all comes back? All right, that's first gear. Halfway through is neutral. Second, third, fourth. Okay. You want to take the ratchet part off, and there's 2 springs there, so you have to be careful. You just go in here and kind of worry it up with the screwdriver. Here's your paws that catch the grooves in the shaft to rotate the drum. Here's your springs for the return action that push on this little square peg. As you turn it one way, this spring will compress. This will come up and catch it with its little edges right there and rotate the drum and then return it back to neutral position so you can go either up or down in the gear train. Okay. There's 1 screw that locates the plate to the top. But you notice right here where these grooves are, there's a little groove in the plate that you line up with one of the grooves in the shaft to make sure everything is centered. And it's any gear, you can be in any gear except for neutral to do that. The 1 screw is right here that holds this plate to the top. Plate comes right off, a gasket back here. A lot of times I've seen these springs, well this one looks like it's broken here. See how the coil's real tight together? Let's pop it out and look. Yes, see that? It's always cheap insurance to put new springs in when you rebuild one of these. The plate comes off, you just peel the gasket right off. And that's your ratchet mechanism. Now since we got that all apart, I always like to take this and fit this back on here and make sure the bushing is nice and tight, which it is on this. Next thing we do is take out, I already loosened this, is your neutral indicator switch. When there's a little nub on the gear, then when it pushes on the ball, it makes contact with the 2 electrodes, indicating the neutral light on. This is your cam follower that actually puts tension on your drum to hold it in gear. And that has a little lock ring. Inside here is a little barrel with a V follower. And given the condition of this follower and these ramps in here, will help make a transmission shift good or shift bad if it's not moving easily. When we put this back together, we'll take a little 3M pad and polish this off and polish the end of this follower to make it smoother. There's the follower, which is spring-loaded. And I like to polish this end off here. You can see where it's shiny, where it was rubbing. So if you polish this off, it'll follow in those ramps real nice. The lock thing comes off. Now, if we have to, we'll take the drum out. The drum has got a shaft, and it's held in place with this set screw, just like the shifter fork shaft. And here's the pin, same as a shifter fork shaft pin. Now, there is no through hole to push the shaft out. On the other end of this, it's got like a little groove you can catch and pry it loose. I've seen guys who've had these apart, and what they'll do is, once the shaft is out, they'll drill a hole through there so they can pop them out easier. Shifter fork shaft comes out, shifter drum shaft, and it has a little O-ring that would go in here to prevent oil from seeping out of that. Then you just kind of wiggle this out. It's a nice tight fit, there's hardly any end play. Like that. What you want to look at is any kind of galling on the grooves. These grooves are where the shifter fork hats fit in, and they'll move the shifter forks back and forth as this rotates. This looks like it's in great condition. You'll notice that this one tooth on the drum has a little notch in it. That's your alignment mark with the gear that's on the end of the shaft, which we'll take out next. The last piece to come out of the top is the shaft, held in place by this cotter pin. We'll use our handy dandy cotter pin puller. Set that aside. Like that. Now we just gotta get the shaft out, which is just like a little press fit, a lot press fit. What is an awful crust in there. What we're doing is we're gonna let that soak and pop it out tomorrow when we go to reassemble. And you can see how we're going to have to go through and dress all this with the stone and the countersink, clean all this, and we'll stone this and check all the threaded holes when we can put it back together. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is take the starter gear out of the starter end cover. We already took the clutch release rod out, came out with the clutch rod. So now we're just going to clamp the square of the kicker shaft in the vise. And this has another lock tab right here. Okay. Here's the lock tab we're bending down. The other one's okay. Then that. We're just going to tap on this. This is the same type of lock around the end of the countershaft. It's got the circle with the little flat in it. The gear comes right off. And the shaft is there. Remember we had that dowel pin that was broken off when we took it apart? It should have been right there. We'll have to replace that. The shaft just pulls right out. Well, like that, and we're going to clean that, and then there's two bushings in that kicker cover. They look pretty good. Looks a little rust in there. In between the bushings is a O-ring. That's to help the oil stay inside and keep from leaking out. These things wear out usually really quick. So when we get it all cleaned up, we'll put it back in without the O-ring and check the fit. But right now man, it goes in nice and smooth with little or no wear. That's it. Everything else now is just cleaning, and we put it back together. Today we're going to start off with reassembling the ratchet top. We've already taken a stone to all the gasket surfaces, checked all the threads, and marked the timing mark on this shifter shaft gear. First thing we do is put the drum back in the top after we've marked the alignment gear on the top. So we just worry this inside. Remember how much fun it was to take it out. Okay. It's not that tricky to align these marks. Just got to do it a couple times to make sure. And you notice that we made a mark on the drum that comes out to here. And then the marks on the shifter cam are marked in yellow here. So as we rotate the drum, we want to make sure that that tooth on the drum falls in between the two teeth on the shifter gear. We got the timing marks lined up between the shifter gear and the shifter drum. We put a new O-ring on the drum shaft and just got it started. So we're going to finish tapping that in. a little grease on the O-ring so it doesn't tear. And what we'll do is we'll look down in here. That's where our set screw goes to keep it from the shaft from wandering out. Okay. Run your thumb over that, make sure it's not sticking up. Make sure the drum rotates nice and evenly, which this one does. Okay, now we're going to go back to the bench vise. And put the plate on, first the gasket. Then the pawl spring plate that goes on. And our screw and washer. I'll get this started and take it off and show you the notches we want to line up. See the notch in the plate? We want to line with the notch in the shaft. That guarantees that the paws will catch these grooves where they should be to shift gears. And we're going to just double check that that's tight. Okay. From yesterday, we had a broken pawl spring, so we're going to replace both of those. That's the broken one there, and that's a new one there.
Okay, got it.
What I usually do is we'll take this and just stick it in the groove here. Don't be surprised if when you're doing this that sometimes they'll pop out and hit you in the head. They don't hurt that bad. That's what they look like. This one. Okay. I like to take some white lithium grease, which usually I like to assemble stuff with, and I'll just smear some in here. Like that. That helps lubricate the spring as it goes back and forth from the pawl carrier. Okay, next is our pawl carrier and the shifter paws and these two little springs. Shifter paws fit inside. Give me one in here. And it goes up and down with the spring. Of course, I stuck that in there. You'll notice that on the paws themselves there's a groove here. And there's a pin that comes in the back side of the pawl carrier that aligns the pawl so it only moves up in one direction, doesn't twist. So what we'll do is take a pawl spring, A little grease on that. A little grease on the carrier. Okay, and see I got them aligned. They're nice and squishy. Now to install this, I like to take it like this between your fingers. Let me wipe my fingers off first. Okay. Turn it over. A finger on each paw, compress it, stick it on like this, sometimes you get these started like this and just kind of walk it up. Sometimes not that easy. Oh, this one moved, that's why. Okay. Okay, we got it this time. Let's hold it in place, and you have to get that little, aha. I'm going to double check it that it moves. Goody. Okay. Now we'll put the cover on this. Our wash boy, Mr. West, cleaned the surface with a wire wheel. And a gasket. You'll notice the gasket has a little cutout here to match the cutout in the plate, like so. Making sure all the holes align. What do you do? Oh, here it is. We stoned the surface here so we get a nice tight seal. A little grease where it's going to rub a little bit. Like that. Okay, now we get our little screws. And we had one short one, remember, from the bottom hole. This also has a cutout here that matches the cutout in the backing plate, like so. Run them down till these just kind of touch. And just kind of snug them down in a cross pattern. All right, there are the 5 screws that screw into the top. We just got to find our little nut that goes on the bottom here. And the ratchet mechanism is done. Our cover with the 2 dowel pin holes and the 3 screw holes. The arm. Check it every step of the way, make sure it's nice and free. This one is, so we must have done something right. You get everything nice and centered, then you come back and snug them down good. And you don't have to lean on these little screws. They're only like a 1024 thread. And if you lean on them too hard, you can strip them out and create more fun for yourself. Okay. Okay. Still works. We have the whole top mechanism pretty much ready to go. Now we're going to put a neutral indicator switch in. A little bit of Teflon sealant on the threads. Like that. Of course, I lost my adjustable wrench again.
Hang it up.
Oh, who would have thought? I'll probably have needed this again. Just a little bit past snug is good. The other piece we have to put in here is our detent that would hold it in gear, the drum and gear. And we have, this is what it looks like. Little end on it. I like to polish this end with like a 3M pad, and I like to polish the bore so it doesn't stick. It just so happens that in our portable drill we have a 3M drum. So we're just going to go over the face of this. Like that, to polish any kind of residue off of it. Take the drum out, and we put the follower inside. Like that. So you have a little bit protruding. Take a 3M pad. And polish it. You see there's a little bit of rust pitting there. smooths it out. Take it and reverse it. You can see the difference between the polished and the as is. We can fix that right up. Just like new. So here's our spring. Give it a light coating of grease. Into the follower. Make sure it works nice and smooth. And we have a new lock ring. Okay, I'm going to pull this out. You can see how the detent is down in here and it rides on those grooves. And we polished the grooves a little bit with a 3M pad also. I can't get enough lever joint. It's fourth, third, second, neutral, first. Everything works good. Now the tab here lines up. So we'll bend that tab up to engage that flat. Like that. And the top's done. Ready to go back on the box. Okay, top's done. We're going to dress the side cover, or kicker cover it's known. When we took it apart, we measured the bushings inside for the kicker arm, and this thing is tight. Only thing we did is we replaced the O-ring inside that seals the oil from coming out. We're just going to reinstall this in the same bushings, although we did get new bushings in Jim's kit. There's just no reason to use them if there's not a need. So what we'll do is we'll clamp this in the vise. A little more grease. Now you notice this big thick washer that rides on the outside like this and prevents the arm from chewing up the aluminum. This washer has a pretty heavy bevel on the inside. The bevel goes outwards against the kicker arm. And that's what we have here. Now we'll just take this. All right, we stuck the arm shaft, the kicker start shaft, in a side cover. The gear goes on next, but you'll notice this gets clocked. There's a flat on the kicker arm shaft that would go that direction, and then your stop that stops on the inside of the transmission case would go at 7 o'clock. And that's about 7 o'clock there. But before we put the gear on for good, we want to put the clutch release arm in. Of course, this one's be a pain. But it's nice when they fit nice and tight like that. And here's our clutch release arm. That goes down through the tower and spins like that. But there's a couple components we have to stick in here first. A little grease. We have to have our clutch release arm. And there's 2 washers that go on the shaft. One has a larger diameter than the other. And what that does, it'll center our arm in the middle where it'll fit perfectly with the throwout bearing. So we get that in there and get it started. Then we take the washer with the larger diameter, and that goes under the release arm. All right, so now it's there, but now you have to wiggle everything around to get the square started. There we are, in your clutch release arm. Now the arm is perfectly centered, so when it engages the throwout bearing, it'll push perfectly parallel on your transmission push rod, the clutch push rod. If you forget that washer, a lot of times this will sag down and put pressure on your throwout bearing, causing the throwout bearing to wobble and fail prematurely. And also sometimes it'll let the push rod develop a little divot on the end, and it'll keep the clutch push rod from acting like it's supposed to. Next is this washer that goes on the bottom, which acts like a deterrent for the cotter pin that holds everything in place. You may remember when we took this apart, the cotter pin had been missing in action. Now we straighten that washer out and it doesn't want to fit. Now let's see. We had to file the internal diameter of that bottom washer to fit over the shaft, and then we slipped a new cotter pin in. Let me show you this before we bend everything over. Here's your clutch arm, clutch actuator, and there's that one flat washer here between the casting and the arm itself. That helps keep this maintained right on the main shaft diameter, the center line. Then there's a small washer that goes here, and then a new cotter pin. That washer keeps the cotter pin from rubbing up here and allows it a little bit of movement, but not much. Now we just fold that cotter pin over and put the gear back on, and this will be done. Here you can see we folded the cotter pin over. We're going to trim that a little bit. Okay, works nice and free, it's not coming out. Now we're ready for the gear. And like I said, this is a stop that stops on the transmission case. Inside the case there's a little metal plate that's held in by 2 screws, and that's a positive stop, so the kick arm will remain in the vertical position when not in use. Yeah. See how this looks. You notice that there's a cutout here, and that cutout is when you put the kick arm on. The bolt that holds the kick arm to the shaft goes through this way, so that has to be vertical. Now the gear, that's at the 7 o'clock position. A new lock ring from the Jim's kit, and the nut. You don't see these too often. It's a specification manual for a 70 to 82 shovel head. Mainly all it does is list capacities, spec finishes, and torques. And it covers all the XL models, FL models, FLT models. And it's ranging in chassis, engine, transmission, and electrical. So we're going to run back here to the FL transmission. It tells you all the specs of what it should be, type, drive, and the torques. So the clutch over 30 to 40. So we'll get our socket, our torque wrench. I just walked by it, of course. Okay. Now we just have to bend a tab over to lock this in place. And this looks like a good candidate. Let me get this over here where you can see it. Now here comes the little tough part. When you get this lock ring down there tight, it presses the tabs against the gear, and you got to get something to start the tab up, like a sharp screwdriver, and I don't want to mess his up. Yes, I do. Okay. Okay, it started there. Then we move on to our little chisel. Oh, look at my hand last one. Make sure we got good contact. Rotates nice. We're done. The side cover. See how that rotates nice? This is still nice and smooth. Ready to go. All right, next subassembly we're going to do is the main shaft. We cleaned that all up with some 3M, checked it. It turns nice and straight. So what we're just going to do is clamp it in the soft jaws like so. And the first thing on is our cluster gear that we've inspected and cleaned. Or actually our cleaning boy did, Wes. Looks really good. Hardly any marks on the gear teeth at all. That goes on first. Like that. And we'll just have to tap that on. Like that. Next it goes on is our ball bearing in its race. We like to replace these things no matter what. Like I said before, they're only 15, 20 bucks. Already pre-lubricated, nice and sealed both sides. And sometimes they're a nice little tight fit in the races. We'll just almost there. You can hear the sound change when we get it seated. More of a ringing noise. Just like that. Goes right on the main shaft like two going just like that. But we're going to need to have a little socket protection here. And since we're centering the bearing on the race, on the shaft, we only want to press on the center of the bearing. Okay, there we are. Next is our lock ring. Has three little tabs that fit down into the splines. But before I put them on, since we're going to have to torque the nut to about 90 foot-pounds, I like to take and bend these tabs up just a little bit to get started, because I've seen many a bearing where this shield has been damaged while somebody tried to stick a screwdriver in her to get the tang started. I just start them all a little bit like 5-6 degrees, like that. And it fits on the main shaft. Then your main shaft bearing nut. Like so. Then this gets torqued down to 110 foot-pounds. You really got to lean on this one. Jeez. One more time just to double check that. Oh, okay. Now we just want to bend the tab up to catch the flat. It looks like this was our candidate right here. So you're going to be careful, just get in there like this. Don't go down, just go up. Like that. Finish it off with a pair of channel locks. Okay. Nice and quiet, just the way we like them. Okay, that's done until we put it in the box, and we'll put the starter gears on here once the box is together. Okay. Next, we're going to put the main shaft, fourth gear, everything in the box, and then prep the countershaft cluster to go in. So give us a couple minutes, we'll get our stuff together, and we'll be right back. Okay, now we're ready to assemble the main box. First thing we're going to do is I like to seal the studs, the mounting studs. There's 4 on the bottom, and you can see where they come through the case. Sometimes people get overzealous when they tighten these things up and they'll loosen the studs in the case, and that's a source of an oil leak. Early model cases, like in the 30s and 40s and sometimes into the 50s, the cases are cast with such porous aluminum that we've actually seen oil seep through the aluminum itself, in which case we use Gliptol, which is an armature paint, to seal the whole inside of the case. Well, in these late model 60s and stuff, 70s, they used a better compound of aluminum, so you really don't have to. But as a precaution, I just like to seal those up. And what I use is former gasket from AV Loctite. It's called Aviation Tech. Comes with a little brush, and I just dab it. Let me get this up here so you can see what's going on. Okay, we'll just dab it all around. And by the time this thing goes back into service, this will be plenty dry. Now I'm going to turn it this way so I can get the other ones. Again, these are interference fit threads, these studs. And the interference fit of the threads is supposed to keep oil from passing through, but not knowing the history of your transmission, you can't really count on that. Okay. Now we're going to install 4th gear and the bearings. There's 44 roller bearings. I'll stick this over here for now. Pull up my little chair. And we've counted out the bearings 3 times just to make sure we got all 44 here. What goes on first is this thrust washer that the bearings actually ride on, and then we'll slip it into the case. Everybody's got a way to do these bearings that they say is the best. The way it's always worked for me is you smear on some nice semi-thick white lithium grease. Then you stack the bearings on it. Now this can be very frustrating, as you're going to see here in a second. And while I'm doing this, I can tell you that the bushing inside here rides on the main shaft, and we mic that out, and it's well worth in spec, like 1/1000. If you need to replace that bushing, you just push the bushing out of 4th gear, push a new bushing in, it comes in the kit. But you have to have it honed to fit to get the proper clearance. One of our friends who does transmissions also, anybody with a Sun and Hone can do that. Usually charge you $15, $20. Most automotive engine shops have a Sun and Hone for when they do wrist pin bushings for car engines. And also, while we were away from camera, we cleaned and inspected every one of these roller bearings, looking for signs of sliding, skidding, marks on them. And they're all nice and clean. We must say this is one of the nicest transmissions we've ever had apart. We did have to heli-cool the hole for the drain plug. Somebody had stripped that out and then held the drain plug in with some JB weld, which is just not the way to go. Okay, after much fiddling around with fat fingers, we got all 44 bearings lined up on the 4th gear. We put a little bit of grease on the brace inside the case. The way I like to do it is I like to stick 4th gear inside, reach through and kind of center it like this, and watch it as it comes up. And see, I missed one. You see where I touched and the bearings fell? So we'll just have to redo that. Now, to be truthful, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to swing this around.
You want me to hold the box?
Let's see here. There we go. See in there? Take your fingernail, wipe it around, wipe any kind of excess grease off to allow you to see if there's a gap in the bearings, which there is not, which means we're kind of successful. All right, now we have to be careful with this. We're going to set it down like this, rotate it, make sure everything spins nice and nicey. Now it's time to put the main shaft in. We're not going to put the seal on, or seal on the case, until we get the main shaft on, because I got this super duper tool from Jim's machine that allows you to press it in nice and even so you don't waste one. Now we'll get the main shaft. And what we're going to need is to start this in like this. But inside, we're going to have to put third gear and the shifter clutch. So we have third gear. A little bit of white grease. We'll go in first. Let's scoot this around. Then we're going to put the thrust washer in, a little grease. Let's step inside in front of the camera for a second. Then the snap ring, new from the Jim's kit. And then the 3/4 shifter clutch. Now this only goes in one way. You can see here how it's marked high gear. That goes against fourth. So I'm going to step in front of the camera again, get all this stuff kind of started in there, like that. I'm going to reach around like this. Okay, you got to start. Okay, third gear slides on. Thrust washer. The thrust washer has two little tangs on it to fit on these splines, so. Sometimes you just got to worry that on. Like that. Now, while you got room to move around in here, you want to get your snap ring started. Now you want to find out where the brake is in it and start it easy. You don't want to deform it too much. That'll reduce its holding capacity in the groove. Here we are. We actually worried the snap ring up onto the main shaft, which I'm pointing to right here. That's going to fit in a groove once we get the main shaft in farther. So we go that way like that. An easy way to seat that snap ring is to take and get your shifter clutch started. Now watch, it could be a pain on that. Because the shifter clutch is splined also. There you go. You can see how we started, and we have the snap ring right here. What I like to do is tap the main shaft assembly in, center the ball bearing carrier in the hole, and we'll just gently tap it in place. And we use the shifter clutch to seat the snap ring. Can you see down in here? You can see the snap ring has seated into the main shaft, but you want to double check it and turn it all the way around, make sure the whole snap ring is seated in that groove. Once that's done, then you want to tap the main shaft all the way in. But first, come over here and look at your fourth gear bearings, make sure with the tapping sensation, nothing has walked out. And we'll finish seating the main shaft. Here we are. Looks good. Now a little bit more. Everything looks good. The ball bearing race is seated against the case. We'll put the plate in to retain that. We're also coming in here to make sure none of our fourth gear bearings came out. And they look good too. So now what we want to do is retain that bearing plate. Okay. Let me get the screws for that. We got one new screw because the other one was bent when we took it apart. 2, 3, 4. We'll pull up the chair and do this sitting. Remember too, we have to orient this plate so the countershaft lock ring will fit on there against the flat. Like right there. And we have to make sure we use the slinger. Okay, they're all hand tight, but I like to go through and give them a little bit extra oomph. It's one thing nice about these snap-on screwdrivers. They have a hex right under the handle. I'm going to need some assistance with from Mr. West to hold the case, because usually I do this in a vise. Okay. We're done that operation. Next operation is going to put the main seal on the fourth gear side. So give us a couple seconds, we'll get that ready and continue on. Okay, the fourth gear seal has always been kind of a pain to put in, but we got a really nice tool from Jim's machine. We've had it for years that makes a simple installation of it. First off though, you're going to put a cork gasket in here. That limits how far the seal will go in. Here's where your seal fits inside that recess. But here is a seal ring. Actually, this will fit inside here. You always pre-lube any seal you use so it doesn't tear. And since this is the surface that holds those ball bearings in place, we're going to put a little grease on that. And we're going to insert this where the notch is. It's usually got little corners that are kind of sharp. So we stick that through the bearing first so it doesn't cut the rubber. And looks like that. As we said earlier, this seal is one of the greatest sources of leaking on these transmissions. So before we put the new seal in, I like to take a little bit of aviation tack and just smooch it around the seal. That'll fill in any irregularities in the case itself, like that. Stick that on there. We're trying to get that on our fingers. The sleeve rides right up there on fourth gear, like that. For years, you would just start tapping that in with a wrench, and hopefully you got it in straight without ruining it. These days, we have this tool from Jim's that would thread on the main shaft like this. And then we have this. This is actually a seal installer and remover. To remove it without taking the transmission out of the frame or taking it apart, you would put this on over here like this and put 3 self-tapping screws into the seal. Then you would pull this out and it would pull the seal out with it. Then you would reverse it and put it back in like we're going to do right now. A couple of thrust washers and a nut. And what this is going to do is push that seal in nice and straight. And it's got an automatic stop on it, so you know you're in at the proper depth. I know not everybody's going to run right out and buy one of these things because it's a couple, maybe 100, 150 bucks, or it was when I bought it. But if you got a bunch of friends who ride big twins and you want to share tools, this would be one of the first tools I'd want. Again, Wes, I'm going to need you to study this because we don't have it in the mount. Ready? Because here's where we're going in. And we're already started. Okay. My lovely assistant, Mr. White. There we are. Now when we go to put the sprocket on, we'll line one of these splines on 4th gear up with the groove on the seal ring, so the seal ring turns inside the seal, not just on 4th gear. We have one more seal to put in on the late model transmissions. There's a seal that seals the main shaft to 4th gear, and we have another special tool for that. Those are the most notorious for messing up. Okay. This is the main shaft seal that seals the main shaft to 4th gear. These are notorious for not working correctly. What we have is a Jim's tool, 2 pieces, a sleeve that fits over the main shaft, like so. Then the seal slides on that like that. Then the driver with a little lip to set it in the correct depth slides over like that, and if Mr. West will hold the case for us, we'll just tap that right in. Can you reach in there, Wes? Easy as pie. The most well spent money for a tool ever is this tool. Either that, you know, I like to buy a lot of seals for 4th gear. Okay, that's the main shaft group done. We'll get to the kicker gears when we go to put the kicker cover together. Next, we're going to go after the countershaft group, which is easy as pie. Okay, now that we have the main shaft in the box assembled, we can turn our attention to the countershaft. Countershaft goes together in one piece. Countershaft has needle bearings, roller bearings on each end. This end is the 1st gear side, And we almost finished the other end. And you put the roller bearings in the same way we put them on fourth gear. Inside the countershaft cluster is a snap ring and then a washer that the bearings ride against. What we'll do is when we put it in, this washer on the primary side will hold those bearings in place. On the opposite end, the first gear side, the first gear thrust washer will hold them in place and set the end float for the countershaft. So the first thing we do is we finish putting the roller bearings in here. Same way, a little bit of grease, hold them in place. There's 22 bearings on each end of the countershaft. We have, this would be fourth gear, third gear, second gear, which is held on by a snap ring. And this is your first, second shifter clutch. You can reverse this to get a better, if your edge is round over, you just reverse it and you have nice sharp edges to engage the dogs on the gear. So when this is engaged, it will go like this and be driving that way. We got the spacer ring here. This is the bushing for first gear, which is just a slip fit into first gear, like that. Then a little bit of grease goes right on the end. Such a nice fit. Like that. Okay, we have a new countershaft that came with our Jim's kit. The one we had before, where the bearings ride, looked okay, but it had some rust in the middle. So we have a new shaft, might as well put it in. O-ring on the left-hand side of the shaft will seal it so no oil will escape past the bushing. Just roll that on. Nice little coating of grease so it slips and slides. Okay, now we want to go ahead and turn the transmission vertical again, like this. I may need Mr. White to assist me. Okay. The countershaft cluster will go in as an assembly. And you can see one bushing, another bushing. This will fit right in there. Like that. Now I'll just look down inside here. You don't have to twist it. No, just hold it. There. Okay. And the first gear thrust washer, which goes between first gear and the case bushing. And then we'll look down here and align that up. Can you see down there?
Yep.
That washer center, you want to get it as close as possible so you can slide the countershaft up through the cluster and index into this hole without knocking any rollers off, which is not as bad as you might think. So we're going to rotate it around like this and slide it up from the left-hand side through the case bushing. Take a little look down here. And here we go. You can tilt this way a little bit more. You can see we started through the first set of bearings, go up through the rest. Oh, how lucky can you get? The countershaft is right there. I'm going to turn this. Remember, we have this lock plate. It has a flat on it. It's got a lock against your main bearing plate. So before we get the countershaft all the way in, we got everything aligned now. Can you see the flat here on the countershaft? All right. And you see how this plate's going to align in there? So we want the flat facing 3 o'clock. So this will line up perfect. So what we do is just turn the countershaft a little bit. You need some pliers there, Mr. West? Mm-hmm. We're going to go this way. A little more. Right there, okay. Push it in. All the way, baby. All the way, baby.
Hang on.
You're gonna, yeah, once that O-ring gets here, it's gonna be a little bit.
I don't think we're on it
Okay.
yet.
It would be the washer, first gear washer. Okay, back it up.
Can you tap it in there just a little
Yep.
bit? Give it a little.
All right, let's stand it up before we do that.
Tell you what, see if you can do it.
Well, I don't think the first gear washer, we have to, let's drag it over here so we can see. Hold it like that. There we go, good. See how it's come out? That's what we want. All right, you can set it down. Just like that. Now we can tap it in all the way. Like that. Put our new lock rim from the Jim's kit in. Like that. Where's our nut? All right, that's 7/8 also. Okay, next thing is the torque, 55 foot-pounds. The countershaft assembly, I will need Mr. West to hold this for us. All this I usually do in the stand, in the vise. That way I can do it all by myself and not have to worry about having Wes over. Somebody may see him. But for this program and the camera angle, we're doing it this way. I always like to torque the countershaft to the proper specs before I check the thrust washer end float. Ready, Wes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I did, 55 foot-pounds. Okay. And what we'll do is measure that distance. It should be between 7 and 12 thousandths. So first, here we are. We'll look for 7. And you want to go down between the thrust washer and the case bushing. Okay. It goes 7. So we'll go to the other end of the spectrum, 12 thousandths. And see, it stops. I'm going off this side of the bushing. Right there. Okay, we know it's not 12, so let's go backwards. So we can at least know exactly what we have. $11. And that stops. You can go for 10. Oh, there we are. 10 thousandths. Inside of the specs. Some people may want to custom grind their own first gear thrust washers, but 10 thousandths plus, by the time you get the oil in there, it'll take up all those clearances. If it's radically off, you try the next size you have. I have a collection of first gear thrust washers. You can buy them in kits of 5 from like Custom Chrome Drag Specialties V-Twin, like the V-Twin package. Also, they make oversized. The biggest the factory would sell you first gear thrust washer was 100 thousandths thickness. V-Twin has come out with 105 thousandths thickness and 110 to compensate for bushing wear on each end of the countershaft. If somebody set up too tight, it burned the bushing, galled the bushing, and you had to resurface it. You also make new bushings in different oversizes too. So you can pretty much get the combo you want. You just may have to spend a few more dollars to get a selection of first gear thrust washers. We got lucky, I had one in the box. So now we can go ahead and bend those tabs over. Looking for the nice flat. This seems to be the best one right there. See, this one's here on the corner, and that one's right on the corner. Can you see that? So we're going to bend that one up. We're going to try and bend that one up. Here we go. That hurt. What you get for not using the right tool. Okay. There we go. Okay, the main box is pretty much all together. So we'll turn our attention back to the kicker gears. Okay, last thing to address on the kicker side of the transmission is the kicker gears that go on the main shaft. We have the compression spring goes on first, and we're going to put on our floating gear. You look at the teeth, they're not rounded over. It's a nice fit. We already checked that on the main shaft. So a little dab of grease that pushes back. This too can be a little bit difficult in that you have to put the keys in the tapered side of the shaft, and they're not square, they're kind of rectangular, so they'll only go on one way. that. All right, we'll start that one. Got both of them in. Push that in. New lock ring. Little tab fits into one of the slots of your choice. Okay. Now we're going to torque that. I think that gets 40 foot-pounds also. $45. Now, to keep everything from turning inside here, we can lock the transmission in 2 gears since we have the top off. This is first, second, and here's a shifter clutch. So we move it over. That now first gear is engaged. Up here is the 3/4 shifter clutch. So if we engage that in the 3rd gear like that, we now have engaged 2 gears, one on each shaft. That locks the transmission up from turning. That way we can go ahead and tighten the nut on the main shaft without having to worry about the main shaft turning. It's locked itself in together. We'll do the same thing when we get to the sprocket shaft. But it doesn't matter if you use 1st and 3rd, 1st and 4th, 2nd and 3rd. It doesn't matter as long as 1 gear on each shaft is engaged. Okay. We'll just fold this little lock tab up wherever it suits us, as long as it hits a flat. Right here looks good. Okay. The main box is now complete. Now we're going to put the shifter forks in and check them for alignment. If you remember back to when we began this, we took the shifter forks out. The shifter fork 1, 2 was closer to 1 than 2, so we're going to rectify that, but we'll check both 3, 4 also. Okay. Everything turns nice and smooth. Okay, next on the agenda is our shifter forks. Here's a 1, 2 shifter fork that I've showed you. Hardly any wear on it. We'll stick that on the shifter clutch. The nuts for the shifter fork adjustments always go to the outside of the case. Like that. We'll just slide the shifter shaft over. Give it a little tap into. Okay. Now what we want to do here. Did I miss that? Shh, I missed it. Give me a second. What I did is I put the shifter fork in the 3/4 clutch. So now I'm moving. This is a tough one because it's right across from the speedometer drive gear. What I'm going to do is come by here, partially engage into 4th gear, so I can slip this shifter fork down in the groove. I still haven't got it over far enough. I'll take that out, make it easier on myself. There we go, got it into 3rd. Oh, 3rd's not gonna work, has to go to 4th. There it's in 4th. And see, I have a nice gap next to the speedometer drive gear. Just slide this in place. Move this back. First, second. We also have in the Jim's kit new shifter fork rollers that follow along in the grooves of the ratchet top drum. So we'll stick those on there like that. We're going to set this to neutral, which is between 3 and 4. We're going to pick up our top gasket and the top. Okay, and this goes on one way only. Like that, like that. So we'll shift the top into neutral. Now usually you'll take what they call a ratchet top aligning tool that'll fit on here. You set pins in the grooves, then transfer the tool to the top, and it'll move the shifter forks where you want. But I mean, if you only do 1 or 2 of these a year, if that, you can get by just using the top itself. See, we're down on the dowel pins that locate everything. The transmission's in neutral, the top's in neutral. So if you carefully roll it off like that, it'll tell you where your shifter forks are. Now, then, can you see down there? See this? See how the shifter fork dog, or the clutch dog, is close to 1st gear, and the distance between 2nd gear? We want to move this shifter fork over. If you can see down here, 3 and 4 is perfect. Well, it's a little closer to 4, don't we like? So we'll move that over to 3. The way you do that is you take the shifter fork shaft out, and there's shims in between the driver and the fork itself that allow you to make that adjustment. So we'll double check. We'll do one at a time. In this case, we'll do the 1, 2. You like to do these in the vise so you can get a good grab on them. These have lock tabs on them. Okay. And that's a 3/4 inch nut. Geez, you gotta know somebody? I'll bring this over so we can show it a little clearer. All right, off comes the nut, then your locking tab. You want to rub your fingers on here, see if there's any shims behind it. And they're not. And here's your shims and a thick spacer. See the shim there? That was driving it over towards first gear. So we want to at least move that over to this side, bringing the shifter fork closer to second gear. Let's see what else we got in here for shims. None. And the shifter fork carrier's got a little groove and a little tab on the inside of the shifter fork that lines it. Oh. Like that. Move the shim over to this side. Locking tab. The locking tab has a little tab on it that fits on the shift fork carrier. The nut has got a recess on the back side. See the recess inside here? That'll fit down over the threads, and if it gets really close, it'll fit down over the carrier itself. Put it back in the vise and snug it. Okay. Come on. There we are. Back to neutral. Looks better. Can you see down there? See how that gap is increased, and a gap here on second? Pretty much equal now.
Very nice.
Okay, I'd say that's done. A lot of guys, not a lot, some people who like to race, a lot of times they'll like to cheat the shifter fork towards second gear thinking that if you're going to start a race, you're already in first gear, so it doesn't have to move that far, and you want that shifter dog a little closer to second gear, so when you make that 1-2 shift at high RPM, you want to positively engage. Same way with third and fourth. A lot of guys will lean towards third gear, figuring that that's where all the acceleration is going to come, and when you're ready to shift into fourth, you can back off the throttle a little bit. So I'd say 1-2 is done. Let's check 3-4 again. 1-2. To be truthful, that looks perfect, like it did when we took it apart. I don't know if you can see all the way down there, can you? See the gap between 3 and 4? I like that. So once again, we pull the shifter fork shaft out. Okay. Bend the locking tab up. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to put it in. Smear a little lube. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier that we put a new O-ring from the Jim's gasket kit here. That seals the shaft to the case. The end of the shaft has got that little notch in it that has the set screw that holds the shifter fork shaft in a case. Here's the notch, here's the threaded hole. So we'll turn that so it's 90 degrees. Tap it in. Check that it lined up. Looks good. Here it is. Goes in there like that. Put the gasket back on like this, And we're ready to move over here to the sprocket. We want to put the sprocket on while the top is still off because, again, we can lock the transmission in 2 gears and get a good grip on the torquing the sprocket nut down. All right, the next item is sprocket that drives the rear wheel. This transmission came with a worn out 22 tooth. You can see how the teeth are starting to wear on this side. It's good to move heavy motorcycles around, but what we want to put on is a 24 that'll give you a better engine speed at freeway cruising. But before we do that, we want to put this little L key, which is going to be hard to show, that locks the seal ring to 4th gear. And that goes in like that. What I like to do is not set in any manual or anything. I'll take a little Permatex silicone, just a little dab, and I'll push it just enough to seal the end of that up, prevent any oil from wanting to come that way. You don't want to push too much in, just a little dab, like that. Okay. Next is the sprocket. Recess goes inside. Like that. Let's see. Tilt this down. Use this to pour 4th gear out a little bit. What I'm doing is I'm using the sprocket nut to pull the sprocket onto 4th gear. After you put that little dab of silicone in there, sometimes it resists coming out all the way, and you want to get it out almost flush. We got the transmission locked in both gears. In this case, it's 4th and 1st. Then the lock ring from the kit. Okay. Okay, Wes, I'm going to need your assistance again to hold the transmission. And the torque for the big nut is 100 pounds. That may be a little tough to hold.
Say I might have to do that Hollywood style.
Now, one other component to this sprocket socket is a little ring, which I'm going to step out of camera and see. It looks like this. What this actually does, it actually holds the sprocket centered on the nut. So you would put it on like this, and the socket is counterbored, so it helps center it. And you just, he's going to hold it. That was a tough 100. But you can see that the nut likes to be flush with the end of fourth gear. Take it out of gear. Rotate it around till we see a nice flat. This one looks the best. We'll start that. Nice and tight. Okay. Next is the cover, the top cover. Okay, we're ready to put the top on, but first, since we have the top still open, we're going to stick the speedometer drive gear back in. A little grease on the drive gear. This way, if it kind of sticks, we can align it with the drive on a countershaft. Goes right in, line the gasket. Here we are. One screw holds it in. It's got a gasket on it. Okay, now we're ready for the top. A little bit more grease smearing on the finger rollers. Put a little grease between the gears here until the oil starts to splash up there. Okay, we're in neutral here. We're in neutral here. Should just fall right on. Just like that. A little nudging. Just like in the movies. Okay, we have the screws for the top. Two long ones. Where's the breather one? Closest to the dowel pin. And the rest around the perimeter. That's our bent screw from the main bearing retaining plate. Since the top is indexed to the case with dowel pins, it's not going to move around. Other applications where there's just a part is held on with a taper in the screws, you want to get all the screw tapers touching first to center it or align it, and then tighten them. Like I said, it's got dowel pins. That's how you can get your alignment to your shifter forks to your top. I always like to start, just like automotive, when you do head bolts, torque head bolts down, you're supposed to start in the middle and work your way to each end equally. Even a factory on later model bikes, they tell you when you do your primary cover screws, you start in the middle and work your way out. Okay, the last piece is a kicker cover. We've got that pre-assembled. We have the throw out bearing that would go into the side cover like this. Want to make sure that engages the lever like that. Now remember we talked about the little ball bearing right there. Got the gasket starter, we'll set that on. That ball bearing will index in this little cutout right there. That keeps the inner part spinning, same speed as the main shaft. You'll notice I'm not using a gasket sealer on the side cover or the top cover. If you prepped your gasket surfaces correctly, you shouldn't need it. Okay. You'll notice too that the kicker gear I've rotated around so there's no plate showing, so these gears will mesh with that gear easily. If you try and force the plate on, what you're trying to do is force this spring back at the same time as you're trying to get every stud and this on the main shaft aligned. So what we do is just turn it around like this. Sometimes you just have to sometimes you get lucky on the first try. Okay. Flat washer on every stud, followed by a nut. You'll notice that some of these studs are longer than others. Like these two would have a little support bracket for your electric starter motor. Over here you may have a support bracket for an oil tank battery box combination mounting bracket. Well, there you have it. It's together. We checked it, even though we don't have the kick arm or the kick arm spring. Everything turns over. We ran it through all 4 gears. It's done. Now, I do this in my garage all the time, helping friends out with their 4-speed transmissions. The way I just showed you is how I learned, is how I practice it. There's going to be different ways to do different things, and there are going to be people out there saying, oh, well, he did that wrong. I do it the way it works for me. That's what we just tried to show you in this program. That's it. It's nothing, no rocket science. You just got to be attention to the details when you do everything. And you think it's bad or you think it's going to break on you, replace it now while you got it apart. It's cheap. You don't want to take this thing in and out of your motorcycle numerous times Oh, because I forgot to do this or forgot to do that. Do you have a manual for your motorcycle, your year? It helps a lot. That gives you all the torque specs. Don't rely on me or this program to give you the torque specs for your particular application. The early model transmissions that don't have these ears on here to support the primary are just the same thing but without the ears. Looks just the same. No big thing. You can do it yourself. If I can do it, you can do it. That's for damn sure. Well, now that we had the transmission overhauled, we figured we'd show you the proper method of putting it back in the frame and shimming it so it has the least amount of resistance and doesn't wear out that fourth gear bushing in the main shaft. What we've done is we loosely installed the plate on the bottom of the transmission so it still slides. This is not the original hardware. That's still soaking to get the grime and stuff off. First thing we do is we're going to place this back on the mounts. There's 4 mounts on the frame. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a 5th mount under the kicker cover. Before we put the plate in, we'll just take a real fine file and just make sure there's no burrs. That'd give us a false reading. Okay, now we're going to throw a transmission in there. I need some assistance from Wash Boy Wes. Thank you. Let's slip it in. Like that. It's not down in the front. There we are. Okay, looks a lot different from when we took it out. Now what we're going to do is take some bolts and washers and loosely affix the frame to the plate. Okay. Maneuver the plate around. I don't know if you remember from when we took this apart. The front plate mounting holes are drilled and tapped 3/8 fine thread. You notice how everything's nice and loose. This moves back and forth. The plate will give a little bit, it comes up and down. All right, the next thing we want to do is take the primary cover, like this, nice and clean now. And there's 3 bolts here that hold the primary cover to the engine. And these 4 studs locate here through the bearing, and that supports the transmission case. So next thing you want to do is just slip this over like this. Let's see, with everything nice and loose, it fits on there nice. What we're going to do is just, this usually has a lock ring that you would bend the ears over on these bolt heads once they were in there tight. But since we're just showing you how to do this now, there's no reason to go to all that trouble, because it's all going to come back apart anyhow for cleaning, painting, and repairing the engine. I should explain too, we didn't move the engine. The first thing you would do is have the engine in there and bolt it down solid. That's, everything is based off the engine mounts. So the engine's in nice and tight and square to the frame. This primary cover, inner primary cover to be specific, is now at right angles to the sprocket shaft and locates the main shaft. And what you want, the reason for this exercise, is to make sure that the sprocket shaft coming out of the engine and the main shaft on the transmission stay in perfect parallel in both planes, like this and like this. That way you're not using up any horsepower to turn your main shaft or your bearing, and you want to keep the bearing nice and tight to the shaft. So now what we're going to do is, there should be washers in here, but just for the sake of this demonstration, okay, we'll just use those 2 for now. So now what we have is we've guaranteed that the sprocket shaft and the main shaft are perfectly parallel in all planes. So to keep this in plane, oh, we didn't clean that bearing out, but we're going to stick the clutch hub on just to get a feel for how much resistance is in the main shaft. So once we get this started here, we're going to go underneath the transmission and tighten the nuts that hold the transmission mounting plate to the bottom of the transmission. Mr. West, you can do that from your side, please. The nuts underneath, can you see them easily?
The plate to the transmission nuts.
The plate to the transmission.
Okay, not the plate to the frame.
Yes.
Tighten them all down.
Snug them up.
Snuggeroo.
Not the plate to the frame, just to the transmission bottom.
Right on.
Now, this doesn't have to be an inner primary to do this. A lot of guys who are running belt drives, like a BDL, has a nice heavy plate that would act in the place of the inner primary. And I think Revere has a two-piece plate. One that would bolt to the engine and one would bolt to the transmission. And then you get your adjustment of your belt tension. But you still want to make sure this is in the same plane. If you don't have an inner primary or a motor plate, what you can do is take a piece of glass, like 1/4 inch thick glass, about 18 inches long, lay it on the bearing surface. You can take this extension off and lay it on the clutch hub without the bearings on it, and you can see if it tweaks a little bit. Okay, now we have the plate tight to the transmission case. What we want to do is take some feeler gauges now and check between the plate and the frame. That's where the distance is going to be made up. So, since we're almost out of time here, we're only going to shim one of these to show you how it's done. But you want to do it for all 5 bolt holes. Okay, we can see light between the frame and the plate. So what we want to do is measure how much of that distance is and make a shim to fit in there. Let's see, we'll start with a 6/1000. And what you want is what they call a plug fit or a slip fit. All right, and 6/1000 won't go all the way. There it is. 6/1000 is too big, so we run up 1, 7. Here we are. Seven feels nice, so we'll try 8. Come on. Here we are. All right, I tried 8 and 8's too tight. So we'll go back to 7. And 7 is nice. Okay, we need a 7/1000 shim. Now there's an easy way to do this and a little bit tougher way. The easy way would be if you had shims for your disc brake rotors. They usually have a 3/8 through hole and they come in various thicknesses. And a lot of times I'll keep a bag of them around, and if it comes to a size I have, I'll just take a caliper shim, stick it in there, and call it good. But I don't have any 7/1000s with me, so we're going to make one. Okay, what I have here is brass shim stock that I bought, 100 years ago, and I'm still using. And it has different leaves with different thicknesses. We'll go through and find our 7 right here. And all we really need is a little circle, but we need a 3/8 hole in the middle. And you can use a pair of scissors to do that, or what I like is this gasket or shim punch set. It has a block with precision holes in it, and you have precision punches, and we'll just pick the 3/8 hole. It fits in there nice and snug. So what we'll do is slide our piece of shim stock in here till it's nice and centered. Let me hold this up for you. See, we have the 3/8 hole centered on our piece of shim stock, and we're just going to whack it with a hammer and make a hole in it. Let me step out for a second. Okay, we have our favorite hammer here. You ready? Punches a hole right through it. Now, since it is precision, it's tougher than hell to get these things out. Again, I'm going to have to step out and go to the vise. Okay, I'm back. There we are. So now to get that shim ready to put in the frame, take a pair of ordinary scissors, and we'll trim a little bit like that. Here we are. I'd make it a lot prettier if this was going together for the final time. Take a hammer and just rub the cut edges like that. And we'll go ahead and stick that between the frame and the plate. Now we're showing you just doing one. You have to do all 5. You've already been on here. You felt what kind of resistance is on your main shaft. Turns nice and free.
We're snugging up.
All right, he's going to snug it up. Let me get it tight. And see, your resistance hasn't changed at all. That means they're not putting any binding on the main shaft because we mounted that plate and shimmed it to its perfectly parallel here. Now what we'll do is we'll do the other back shim between the plate and the frame. And we'll go to the front and do the right front frame, the plate mount, because it's easy to get to. And we'll do the 5th mount. Once that's done, you know that plate is not going to move. Your resistance is not going to change. So what we'll do is we'll take this plug chub off, we'll take the inner primary off, and then you'll do your left front mount to the plate to the frame, because now it'll be easy to get to and it won't change because you've already done everything else. It only takes an hour or so to do, even if you have to go, cut shims out with your scissors or a gasket punch or something like that, but this adds so much life to your transmission, to your bushings in your 4th gear, you can't believe it. And then once you get on here and you adjust your primary chain, you make sure you leave 5/8 of an inch up and down play, then you're not stressing out either shaft or either bearing. Once you're there, you're good to go. Long life. Oh, don't forget to put oil in the transmission. That's it. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't show the earlier versions of the transmission top. These ratchet tops were introduced in '52 and were available all the way up until they changed the case in the top in '77, '78. Before the ratchet top, we had what they call the manual top, or it was called a fumble finger top. When you shift this, it would return to a specific setting. When you shifted a manual top, it would stay in position. And this arm was hooked to a lever that hooked to a tank shift. And what you do is you move this tank shift lever back into different gears. Over the years, when the chopper craze hit and everybody wanted what they call a suicide clutch, you would just put a handle on here, turn your foot shifter or the piece up here for your clutch into a clutch pedal that had no spring, and would just go back and forth. It would have no friction, I'm sorry. And you would just be able to sidestep the clutch and do better burnouts. This top has the same type of drum, shifter gear, everything, and it would go right on this transmission if we decided to take the ratchet top off. We would just have to check the shifter fork alignment to make sure it works the way it should. Before 65, this was the first year for electric start. That's why these ears and studs, the electric starter would be here, and that would locate everything nice and tight. Let me back up here. We have borrowed an early model 4-speed transmission case. It looks like this. Basically, it's the exact same as this case without the ears. And he used these from 36 up to 64, 65. Inside looks all the same. It would take the same top, would go on, just like that. The main shaft would stick out the same place, everything. Your your sprocket would work on this. On these transmissions, you go to 1 tooth larger sprocket because there's no interference here from the chain. 24 is about the biggest you can go on these things. You can get up to like a 25, and they actually made 26s. The only other difference we want to make note of is the transmission length, the main shaft length. You notice how far this sticks out of here? That's for the early, this is the second length. The early models were, I think, 12 3/4. Then he added a 1/4 inch to the main shaft length when he went to electric start, because the electric start gear on the clutch basket is a 1/4 inch. In 1970, when they went to an alternator lower end, this is a generator model, there would be an alternator in the engine cases right here. Well, since he added the alternator, that moved everything at a 1/4 inch. Consequently, they went to another 1/4 inch length on the main shaft. So if you're buying a transmission, you have to know what kind of engine sprocket shaft you have. The early ones, 36 up to 52, I think, were what they call a tapered sprocket shaft. After that, they went to a spline. This one is stuck on there for good. But after that, just make sure you know what parts are going to fit. If you got a 52 lower end, you want a main shaft that's going to fit a 52 motorcycle. Consequently, if it's a 36 knucklehead bottom end, it's rare money, but that would have a tapered sprocket shaft, and you would have a different length transmission main shaft. They're about all the same amount of money. You just got to know what you're picking. And it's hard if you just pick one up, put it in there, get there, and all of a sudden your primary drive won't align. Then you're in big trouble. Or you're in expensive trouble, I should say. And that about wraps it up. We'll get into more stuff as we go along, but that's it for this video, or DVD, or whatever medium you choose to use here. Until next time, see ya.